A new Metawatch article for Warhammer 40k just dropped and has some interesting things to say about the state of the game. So let's talk about it and some of the problems with how GW and their design team may analyze data from the community. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi. I got my lights on for this video. Hopefully it doesn't look too bad. Let me know down in the comments. And let's talk about some Metawatch. A new article just dropped today, and it's a bit of a weird one. As always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content and analysis, go ahead and drop a like on the video, subscribe on the channel, do all that YouTube stuff. You know the drill. And let's dive right in. Now, for those who don't know, Metawatch is the series of articles posted on the Warhammer community by the Games Workshop design team with a focus on the ongoing balance, upkeep, and statistics of competitive play in both Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar. Although today, obviously, we're going to be talking about Warhammer 40k. The article that dropped today has, just like most Metawatch articles, a breakdown of faction win rates from the beginning of the latest season, that being Arcs of Omen. Because we had a huge meta shakeup, not only with a balanced data slate, new points values for units, and different missions and secondary objectives for basically everything in the game that dramatically changed the balance of different factions compared to one another. Now, the difference between this Metawatch article and previous ones is that the statistics being presented here make no goddamn sense. So let's take a look at this win rate breakdown from the Warhammer community article. It seems pretty straightforward, but once we compare it to community-sourced stats, we get some insane divergences. Let's look at, for example, my very favorite source, Cliff Thomas's incredible stat check visualization, which takes win rates and results from larger Warhammer 40k tournaments and puts them in an easily parsable visual format. I'll put a link down to his stats in the video description. Highly recommend you check it out. Now, looking at these two sources together, we get some pretty glaring differences. I'll give you some examples. Genestealer Cult and Dark Angels are listed as mostly the same. These are inarguably the number 1 and number 2 factions in the metagame and will most likely need some tweaks as the season progresses. The third place spot is pretty contentious, however, with the Metawatch article putting it as Adeptus Custodes at a 56% win rate. However, StatCheck presents Adeptus Custodes at a 52%. Now, this doesn't seem like a big difference, but the reason that it is because the stated goal of the design team is to keep the entirety of the game within the bracket of a 45 to 55% win rate. Anything above or below that range is most likely going to get buffs or nerfs in the next balance update. Demons are the reverse, however, listed as a 54% win rate on Metawatch, but a 56% on StatCheck. Chaos Knights are a huge difference with a 45% on StatCheck, but listed in Metawatch as a 53%. A whole 8% differential that I think gives you an incorrect interpretation of the power level of that faction as a whole. Factions like Adeptus Sororitas, Chaos Space Marines, and Blood Angels are listed as sub 45% on StatCheck, but posted on Metawatch at that 45% level, meaning that they will likely not get reevaluated for new buffs if that win rate holds true. And the one that hits closest to home are some of the lowest ranked factions in the game, at least according to StatCheck. Factions like Tyranids and Leagues of Votann, who were the recipients of some enormous nerfs from the end of Warzone Nephilim into Arcs of Omen. On StatCheck, they're posted as a low 40% win rate, but on Metawatch listed as a perfect, flawless 50%. Clearly, the massive and highly controversial nerfs that were levied on both of these factions were totally perfect, no problems whatsoever, and totally justified. To my knowledge, Metawatch doesn't publish any of the data that they use for these articles or the sources that they're getting them from, but they do discuss the types of data that they look at, which could give us some insight into how they're actually getting these numbers.
So we try to take a really broad kind of cross-section of data. We collect it from all over different size events, so from all over the world. And we do look at kind of small events, big events, events where people play 3 games, events where people play 5.
The stats for Metawatch take into account not only larger events, 2-day, 5-round events, but also smaller RTTs, which could have a large player base and across the entirety of the community probably have a larger player base than participants in GTs from a week-to-week basis, but are much shorter small events. For those who don't know, an RTT stands for Rogue Trader Tournament and is typically a 3-round, 1-day event that will play to the end of those 3 rounds, but will typically not have a single undefeated winner. Now, I think the reasoning for this is pretty solid. The design team's trying to get a holistic view of 40k at many levels of play, rather than just the highly competitive GT and Major games, but also games that a lot of players would interface with. In theory, this makes sense, because you'd rather have factions that are balanced across the board of the entire game across all levels of play than factions that can potentially dominate too far in one direction in one format or another. But I do think it opens the doors to a couple potential problems. Compared to multi-day events, RTTs tend to have a much wider variance on skill levels, especially at the undefeated bracket, since there is a larger pool of undefeated players proportionally at the smaller event. At the end of the first day, and thereby at the end of the event, you're going to have more players that are X and O than in a large event that would play until only a single player is undefeated. With these larger pools in each bracket, the pairings themselves tend to be pretty random. So a weaker faction has a much higher chance of dodging particularly strong opponents. Now, honestly, that's actually one of the reasons I like participating in RTTs, because the meta feels much more open. There's less of an incentive to play only the stuff at the top echelon of whatever faction you're in. You can kind of compete with anything, and as long as your player skill is up to snuff, you have a pretty good chance of winning. And in fact, individual player skill has a much greater impact in your games at an RTT, since there tends to be a wider variance of play levels. So while they're super fun and oftentimes really interesting, and you can see lists and army styles that you'd never see at a GT level, it's not really an accurate portrayal of actual faction power level. Now, because of the larger dataset and wider variety of matchups, I do think that RTT data is useful for analysis, but not necessarily in terms of holistic faction win rate. I think looking at RTTs based on the faction versus faction balance, where you can try to see which factions are very specifically oriented at beating other factions, that is a treasure trove of data that these small one-day events can give you. And even more so, since the chances of you randomly hitting factions that you may not normally see in a highly competitive GT level is much higher, and especially at a higher volume. But I'd hesitate to say that's representative of the actual faction power. Now, as I said at the top, I do understand the reason that the design team takes these small event data into account. I just hope that it's not being held as gospel or weighted as highly as results from these larger GTs, because making changes based heavily on them can have some significant consequences, especially when comparing those factions to a faction that has a higher power level and player skill is less involved. As player skill becomes more equalized, your ability to win becomes more heavily based on your faction's power, and that's at the point that finely tuned balancing really helps the game.
Sometimes people will see, various commentators talk about kind of win rates and things in the meta, and sometimes they're taking a slice of the data. So some people look at kind of, majors and super major events.
I feel very called out right now. Now, a big talking point during the Metawatch article and the video was the status of the Deathwatch faction.
Deathwatch.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
Which are really struggling right now, having lost a bunch of mechanics both in Armor of Contempt and their Army of Renown, but with effectively no buffs outside of some points changes, since they do not benefit from most of the additional Space Marine buffs that the faction received. According to the Metawatch article, they are conclusively the worst army in the game, but this doesn't take into account other Space Marine chapters. Chapters like Imperial Fists are doing dramatically worse than Deathwatch, which is actually saying something given that Deathwatch have, I believe, a sub 40% win rate. So what gives with that? Why aren't Imperial Fists being discussed here? And I think the answer to this question gives us a good opportunity to discuss the Space Marine issue when it comes to statistical analysis and discussion of power level. Unlike every other faction in the game, the Space Marine faction is really big, like super duper big.
Huge.
Its regular sub-factions, the Codex compliant chapters, each individually have a PDF supplement of unique mechanics all their own. This is a luxury usually reserved for only the design team's favorite sub-factions in other armies, with a handful of sub-factions having a currently legal supplement, although every Space Marine chapter gets one. But on top of that, it also has non-compliant sub-faction supplements. These are additional printed materials coming in a whole separate book for a specific number of chapters, that rely very heavily on unique rules, or units. The specialization of Space Marine subfactions, alongside their generally high play rate, begs the question, how do you appropriately analyze the power level of Space Marines? Is each subfaction and supplement a whole army that needs to be balanced compared to the rest of the game independently? Or do we just look at the army as a whole, regardless of the status of its supplement, and let the worst chapters suffer for the sins of the one or two at the top? Now, I don't know if there's a concrete best answer for this, but I kind of agree with the way Metawatch broke it down. All of the compliant chapters are just rolled into the Adeptus Astartes faction. Then, each non-compliant chapter that has its own printed supplement is posted individually. This is because these tend to rely more heavily on their supplement mechanics than they do the core Space Marine ones, whereas the compliant chapters generally live or die on the power level of the Space Marine Codex proper. Now, this does have the effect of diluting the win rate and power level of some especially strong sub-factions like Iron Hands, with their still numerous but significantly more awful cousins in factions like Ultramarines or Imperial Fists. But honestly, the most important breakdown is between the non-compliant chapters, who have much more unique mechanics that can independently be balanced more effectively. Now, does this mean that bad chapters like Ultramarines or Imperial Fists will not see a significant update or an uptick in win rate this edition? That is probably the case. But the other question is how much of a bad thing that is. Controversially, I actually think it's fine. The only difference between a Space Marine chapter and a subfaction from any other codex in the game is cultural rather than functional. The community likes to treat each Space Marine chapter like its own little army. But if you compare a Space Marine chapter to a Eldar Craftworld, a Votan League, or a Heretic Legion, the number of unique abilities that they have compared to other very unique subfactions is pretty similar. The comparison with Heretic Astartes is a good one because Heretic Astarte legions have basically the same number of unique rules, warlord traits, stratagems, secondary objectives that Space Marine chapters. But the question is never raised whether Heretic Astartes legions should be approached separately. Instead, the faction is always rolled up into whichever legion is the strongest. Opening up Codex compliant Space Marine chapters, even those with a relatively low play rate, to being balanced with the rest of the game independent of one another, opens the floodgates for the same thing to be required of the dozens of other subfactions elsewhere in the game. And while obviously I'd prefer to see every subfaction in the game be very playable, I don't know if that would do too much for the game right now. And I think it would put undue strain on the system. We're already complaining about the rate of updates and balance changes to the game, and imagine having that, but applied to dozens of sub-factions every couple of weeks. And generally, they encourage players of other factions to swap between sub-factions as the meta requires. And honestly, I don't really see why Space Marines should be any different. Now, obviously, I don't wholly agree with all of the methods of data collection that the design team is using, and I do wish that these articles were a little bit more transparent about where these numbers come from, because they are so different from the numbers that we've been working with previously. And obviously, a grain of salt may be necessary when digesting these Metawatch articles. They are ultimately marketing material that are designed to make the design team and their balance changes look as effective as possible. And while those are my worries about the Metawatch article series in itself, I do still appreciate the balance changes being made to the game. And while I may not entirely agree with the stats that Metawatch posted, if you look at stats from Metawatch or any other source, I think the conclusion is pretty obvious. That 40K is in one of the most dynamic and balanced periods of its very long life. And I hope that just continues to get better as the seasons roll on. And with that, that's all I have to say about this Metawatch article. Pretty interesting stuff. Let me know down in the comments what you think about it, and let me know down in the comments what you think about it and the numbers being pushed by this article. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.